Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Just wanted to let you all know that the program is being recorded. Hopefully, everyone will put yourself on mute. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat box if they're technical questions. We do have a robust set of questions, so if time permits, we may get to the question box, but we may not. Thank you again so much. I am Gloria Blackwell, today's CEO, and welcome to today's alumni conversation, Grassroots Feminism in Higher Ed, Building Coalitions for Women's Rights. I thank you so much for joining us in what we know is going to be a timely and compelling conversation. That's because we are in a critical defining moment, one in which access to education and equity and inclusion are facing unprecedented threats in a very volatile political landscape. At AAUW, we know that higher education is more than just a pathway to opportunity. It's a platform for resistance, economic empowerment, and progress. So, as we navigate the pressures of the current landscape, it's essential that we lift up feminist voices within our higher education institutions who are committed to mobilizing for change. Today's conversation brings together two extraordinary scholars and AAUW Fellowships alumni whose work is grounded in activism, academic excellence, and coalition building. They exemplify what it means to lead through action, scholarship, and solidarity. So let's get started by introducing our panelists. Dr. Agatha Beins is a 2009-10 American Dissertation Fellow and is currently an associate professor in the Multicultural Women's and Gender Studies program at Texas Women's University. She's the author of Liberation in Print, a powerful exploration of how feminist periodicals shaped social movement identities in the US. Her interdisciplinary work spans feminist theory, archiving, activism, and poetry. And she currently serves as editor of films for the Feminist Classroom. Welcome, Agatha. Next, we have Dr. Elizabeth Bernstein. She's a 2005-2006 American Fellow and is a professor and chair of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies and professor of sociology at Barnard College. Her groundbreaking research on gender, sexuality, and the political economy of the body includes the award-winning books Brokered Subjects and Temporarily Yours. She is also the principal investigator for the Gender Justice and Neoliberal Transformations Working Group, a scholarly collaboration sponsored by the Barnard Center for Research on Women. Together, they'll guide us through an urgent exploration of how feminist research and organizing within higher education can challenge regressive policies and build lasting movements for justice. We invite you to participate, reflect, and carry these insights back to your campuses and communities. Thank you for being here. So let's get started. So, uh, first question is pretty obvious. In the current political moment, how do you see shifts in policy affecting women's educational opportunities? Let's start with you, Agatha.
Thanks, Gloria. Thanks for making space for this conversation. And I have a lot of gratitude to your staff who organized the logistics that brought us all here today. So I feel like, of course, we could spend the whole hour on just this question. I think for me, these shifts in policy are important to think about in material terms and cultural terms. And so one thing materially that seems really important is access. And for me, this became really palpable when talking with colleagues about how things like cuts in funding to federal grant recipients were affecting people's access to higher education. It's not just the kinds of things that we might be able to research or study or learn about But as a result of cuts to her funding, she was no longer able to support students to work with her. And so to me, this was a dimension of these kinds of policy changes that might not be talked about or as visible. And so I think that that's important, especially because people like women, people who are racially minoritized and who experience other forms of disenfranchisement are really likely to experience these policy changes in a much more negative or harmful way than people who might have access to other social privileges. So I think these material dimensions are important. And then just briefly to open up the conversation about the impact on opportunities more culturally. And to me, this is about, of course, what we get to teach and learn about. And so when policies censor us, they prevent us from making accessible the stories and the histories and the injustices and social movement successes that have shaped the world around us. And so I think that's important to remember in relation, again, to the way people are minoritized, because folks who have been less visible in history and sites of power, again, are more likely to be negatively impacted by these changes in policy. So yeah, and I will just, highlight two things, and I don't know, Elizabeth, yes, I'm looking forward to your comments about this, but even things like firing the Librarian of Congress, Carla Hayden, while not a direct, sort of impact on education itself as an institution, I think these kinds of policy changes will ripple outward. And it's important for us to pay attention and think about how they're interconnected.
Absolutely. And so can you elaborate a bit on how does your work inform activism in response to these changes?
Okay. Well, I hope it does in ways that I might not yet be aware of. But I think for me, as someone who teaches in the field of women's gender and sexuality studies, I really want to make the relevance of classroom content and the topics that we teach and research clear to students who I get to work with. So I think that that's important to me because I see it as an intentional investment in social justice making to kind of push back against the ways these policies might be having negative effects. And so I think this relates to just my sense of activism as kind of broad and encompassing more than things like what we might think of as public protests, but also the kinds of intentional efforts that we might do on smaller scales to bring about changes that get us closer to liberation. And so, so I think in the classroom, I really try to do that. And then for me, it's also about my decisions, again, to really invest in supporting, sustaining, making accessible, and building our cultural institutions. And so that's something that I try to do locally and think about through a feminist perspective. So I'm able to work with our local community arts organization to collaborate with them on a feminist art exhibit that they're planning this summer. And so the chance to make these campus community connections to me is an important part of kind of developing broad-based solidarities that can help us more robustly resist when policies have these effects on specific institutions.
Very good point when you talk about going out into the community and making that connection and that collaboration between the community and campus. Thank you. What about you, Elizabeth?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Gloria. Thank you, Agatha, for getting us started. Thank you for convening this forum, so necessary. And there's been so much talk about what's happening on college campuses and the effects of current federal policies on higher education, and too few conversations about the specific ramifications of those changes for feminism and for the study of gender and sexuality and so forth. So I am really, really glad that you've convened this conversation. I appreciate it. Agatha, I wanted to say I agree with so much of what you laid out, and I thought your initial the lens that you shared with us, the cultural and the material registers for understanding these changes is exactly right. And so I'm going to go over some of the same terrain, just maybe adding a few things. I mean, in terms of and here it's maybe interesting for us to compare notes. As I understand it, you're at a public institution in Texas. I'm at a private liberal arts institution in New York. Now, not just any private liberal arts institution. I happen to be at Barnard in Columbia. So we're in some sense in the center of the storm, as as both of you probably know, and many of our, the people who are with us today. Columbia was the first elite private institution that was targeted with $450 million in funding cuts. So, so certainly the material consequences of this are profound. And, and many of us know, but not everybody, that a lot of those cuts specifically targeted research that pertains to the study of gender and sexuality, race, diversity, social justice in myriad forms, HIV, LGBTQ, so on and so forth. So, so it's not random at all. And, NSF, for example, some of you may know, released a list of banned words and funding applications, which featured all of these words and more, including the word women, right? So that will, if you submit a grant, that has the word women in it, it will be flagged, and its fundable potential will be questioned. So that's good to know. Just last week, the NIH also announced something similar in terms of $1.8 billion in funding cuts. So, so the material consequences are real. And not just for large research universities. I also, and here's where, we circle back to the gender question. So I'm at a small liberal arts college affiliated with a major research university. Barnard has a much smaller endowment than Columbia, and certainly than Harvard. So, so which kinds of institutions are in a position to withstand the onslaught? What will it mean for research going forward? So on and so forth. The cultivation of new communities of scholars, graduate students. Very, very chilling if we think about it at these levels. Then at the cultural level that you also spoke of, I mean, I think this is equally important, as you suggested, because it seems to me what is happening in the banning of certain words and so forth, and the banning of fundable subjects, and soon we'll see how far this goes. Will it look like what happened in Florida and Utah and other places and in other countries? With with quasi-authoritarian takeovers like Hungary, will gender studies departments be the next target? Possibly. I mean, we will see. Christopher Rufo, who is one of the architects of federal education policy right now, has promised nothing less. So, these are the kinds of challenges that we're facing, right? And I think. At the cultural level, again, I think the goal seems to be to make certain concepts unthinkable, certain analytics inaccessible, certain ways of understanding the world out of reach, not available, and as a way of stifling political action. Right.
Thank you. And I think that starting out with that sort of contrast between, right, being at a public university versus being at a private university, seeing the impact. And I know that, certainly we read about Columbia, every day in the news, right? And what's going on. So when we think about what's going on, how can we draw parallels between sort of the historical role of activism in shaping feminist identity, right, and the ways that women's movements today can continue to evolve, right, in an era where both education and women's rights are under threat? Start with you, Agatha.
Thank you for this question. And thank you, Elizabeth, for bringing up the importance of the kind of the ways in which higher ed is structured sort of on the local scale, right? Which is important to pay attention to in terms of how these policies might be manifesting and affecting us. So I think for me, kind of building on your comments about, especially where you kind of left us with this really powerful thought about how these policies are working to make certain things unthinkable. I think for me, this puts a different framework around something I was thinking about in terms of what we have inherited from our feminist forebearers in terms of historically, and especially the 1970s, which is my where my heart is in terms of my research and teaching very much. I've spent a lot of time in archives reading feminist newsletters and newspapers, which I think really paints a powerful picture of feminism at the grassroots local scale during that decade. And so that's part of the context I'm bringing to my thoughts here. And I think what I really saw happening in these grassroots, these mimeographed newsletters from the decade is the way that people were basically speaking truth to power, right? Calling out how power functions, naming it, not letting it hide as a kind of invisible, unmarked status quo, or just the way the world works, but making us see that it is something that is the product of certain historical, cultural, political, economic forces that we haven't inherited historically. And so I think part of power's invisibility, or part of power's power is its invisibility, right? We don't talk about it, we just let it exist because that's the way the world is. And so for me, something that I bring up as an example in one of the classes I teach to make this palpable, hopefully for students and for me each time. It's from Jo Freeman, who was a Chicago-based feminist activist and really, yes, and deeply involved in the Chicago women's liberation movement. And she writes about her time at Berkeley in the 60s, which then was a relatively progressive institution, politically progressive. And on reflecting on her undergraduate education, she remarks that she realized that she never had a woman as a professor in all of her time there. And so that's important to notice. But for me, like the most profound part is what follows when she says that not only did she not have any women who were instructors, but she didn't even notice that she didn't have any women who were instructors. And so I just think that thankfully our higher ed is different now. But for me, feminism was really important in the ways that it made those kinds of things visible. It made us notice these absences, these erasures. It allowed us to think the unthinkable. Oh gosh, yes, this is another question that I feel like we could talk the whole hour about. And so I'll say one more thing that maybe we can expand on later in various ways, but I think can sometimes be dismissed. And so from the 70s, one of the kind of mantras was the personal is political. And I think that that's something that can still have relevance today in the work that we do. I think we need to make sure we don't turn it into a kind of stereotype or caricature in which it's just people kind of sitting around complaining about the problems they might experience and calling that politics, but recognizing the ways in which our individual experiences are an effect of these larger, again, these larger systemic forces that we don't have a lot of control over. And so understanding these connections, I think, can help us kind of better navigate the world on a daily scale, but also make those structural and institutional changes. So I am really wanting to make a renewed kind of commitment to making those connections clear between the personal and the individual, and then the structural and the political.
Excellent, really excellent point. And when you talk about the sort of lack of even noticing that Jo had any female professors, it reminds me, that one of the reasons that AAUW started in the first place as an organization was to increase the number of women in academia, right? So that you did have role models, so that you did see yourself, and that you could see yourself as becoming a part of that larger landscape. That's really good, and just the points around, making those connections. So Elizabeth, when you think about, here we are with women's rights and education under threat, what is that connection between that historical role of activism and shaping feminist identity?
Yeah, right. Okay, so a lot to say here. In a US context and also in a global context. So let me just, say a little bit about both of those. And I think, Agatha again gave us some great examples that we can draw and should draw inspiration from. As I do as well. I also, just as a sociologist, I want to think about some of the differences, especially in the US case. So, what we had in the United States with the rise of second wave feminism, it coincided with the growth and expansion of the post-war university. And so there was that dovetailing, which serendipitously also, afforded the potential for feminists and others to claim space within the university, right? Which we had to fight for, and we did, and we won that space. One of the challenges now, as I think about this, and I do spend a lot of time thinking about this, as chair of a department, as a member of the executive committee of the American Association of University Professors at my own institution, is what to do now in this moment of retraction, right? So, so how to create that space when the very idea of the university is under siege, when the money is being cut, when the university in a US context is getting smaller rather than bigger, when there's less and less money and less space. And there are no easy answers for this. And again, here, maybe Agatha and I can talk more about the difference with public institutions and private institutions. I've been thinking a lot about private institutions such as my own, and thinking about small donor models, actually, other ways of fundraising, and thinking along with members of my administration, other faculty, and other departments about what might be possible. So, at the public institutions, I mean, there's the public cuts. So the private institutions, one of the things that has produced this moment, I think, and it's sort of a cautionary tale, is a shift to a mega donor model where there's reliance on very few donors who are maybe susceptible to influence from people in the federal government, and too much power in too few hands, and that has the potential to have troubling consequences for those of us who are trying to do the pedagogical and scholarly work on the ground. And so I'm asking myself and asking other colleagues, what else can we think about? What other kinds of structural changes could we imagine in this moment? So taking this moment of crisis as one that is full of challenges, which it is, but also potentially as an opportunity to think, how can we do things even better if and when we manage to rebuild, which we're going to need to do. I mean, another lesson of history is that none of this came easy. None of this was given to anybody. It had to be fought for. It was built once. It will have to be built again. Can we build it better, right? Can we address some of the other lessons of history about, now that we know, how it's possible to dismantle it, what can we do the second time around? In terms of historical lessons from other contexts, and again, here I'm thinking about other places and cases in which universities have been under assault. I'm thinking again about places like Hungary, like Turkey, like Brazil, and I'm thinking of a colleague who recently presented on what happened in Brazil just a few years ago, and right-wing takeover of the university. But then it was, then it flipped back. So I also want to avoid a kind of fatalism here, while thinking about, as Agatha said, the kinds of coalitions we're going to need to sustain us in this moment, while we're working on building something else, right? And so I'm thinking about coalitions here in the US, but also global coalitions. And one of the things that we're doing at the Barnard Center for Research on Women is we are partnering internationally, increasingly, So, for example, we are trying to mount a conference on gender and the global right, and we're going to rely heavily on our international partners, both for lessons from history and for material sustenance to make the project possible. So I think that's something else we can learn from how we're not the first people to encounter this. That's what I'm trying to say. I mean, it's nobody thought, so many of us thought it can't happen here, but it's happening here and it's happened in other places, and we can learn from those examples too. Right.
Absolutely. Really, really great points. And you're right. It didn't happen. We didn't get here overnight. We had to fight in order to get to this point. So it wasn't easy to build it. Certainly, it shouldn't be effortless to dismantle it. And obviously, people are going to have to step up and resist. And that's a great point in bringing up the global piece as well, right? Because AAUW funds international scholars. We've been doing that as well for over a century. And, we are going to not give up on our commitment to funding women across the globe, despite the ways in which they could be impacted by, what is happening with the current administration about who they think, is going to be let in to our country, et cetera. And so I think that, just making sure that you're having that global connection really is important, as well. So when you think about uh, the connection between, grassroots organizers as well as the campuses, how can collaboration look and how can it be more effective to sort of resist these kinds of attacks, really, when you think about it in the context of education and policy? Um, Agatha, what do you think?
Yeah. I my mind is buzzing with both sort of anxiety and possibility, thinking about, how we can use this moment as one, I think, like you were mentioning, Elizabeth and Gloria, to really catalyze solidarities that we might not have recognized as valuable or important when we are experiencing moments of kind of stability or feeling supported. Whereas in moments of precarity or instability, it can make visible the ways in which these struggles that we might not have recognized as interconnected and start recognizing them as interconnected and using that to create the networks, which to me contrasts in a hopefully relevant way with what you were mentioning earlier, Elizabeth, about, models of funding and donors and the reliance on these mega donors, which is very much about narrowing the sources of resource and support for education. And I know that all institutions are grateful when large donors are dropping lots of money to support the campus. And two of the visible, relatively recent moments of large donations have occurred here at Texas Women's University to fund the Woodcock Institute, which is a sort of interdisciplinary institute, but is focused on neuroscience. So it's very much, a STEM endeavor. And then also relatively recently, an alumna donated millions of dollars to the business school. She was a graduate of the business school. And so it does make me think, though, that these mega donors often give very targeted funding. And so where they choose to support the campus is something that is worth noticing as well. And as someone who teaches in the humanities and the more humanities-based fields, we are not often visible as sites of support. And this is not to disparage people in business or economy or science at all, but to recognize the impact of these kinds of consolidations. Whereas in contrast, as y'all are just echoing, building broader networks and solidarities, I think, is really where we can find spaces to thrive.
Definitely. So when you think along the same lines, what are your top thoughts, Elizabeth, when you think about grassroots organizers and collaborating more effectively to resist the attacks when you think about the context of education and policy?
Yeah, consistent with what most of you have said so far. I'll add a couple of other things into the mix. You know, and there are things that I've always said and believed in my teaching and scholarship, but they have new relevance now in this in this moment. Number one, that so many issues that we don't necessarily identify as feminist issues, in fact, are, right? So not just the, you know, a traditional suite of feminist issues that pertain to things like, you know, reproductive rights and bodily autonomy, of course, those, but so many more. Political economy is a gender issue. Gentrification is a gender issue. Universities are gender issues. You know, all kinds of things are gender issues. Climate change is a gender issue, et cetera. And conversely, that the politics of gender, when read the other way, affect everything else too, right? And there's so much scholarship on this that I could point to. So, immigration is about gender and has gender implications and so forth. It's about families, it's about kinship and so on. And I begin with this prelude just as a way of saying that potentially the people that we could form coalitions with should be, should or could be in political struggle with. It's a large number of folks. I mean, it's self-identified feminists, but so many other people as well who are engaged in all kinds of social justice issues. And so one of the things that we're trying to do at Barnard and Columbia right now, and have been pretty successful in recent months and weeks, is form coalitions, for example, you know, between the downtown humanities folks, the gender studies department, which is in the eye of the storm, and the people uptown at the Columbia University Medical Center. I mean, now they're in the eye of the storm too, but they didn't know it 6 months ago, and now they find that they are. And then to ask, you know, what are the connections between, you know, the assault that started and what we're doing earlier, and now what's happening to them with their funding cuts? And it's on the one hand, you know, it may look like just an accident of politics, but I don't think it is. I mean, I think it's by design. And some of us who've been organizing for a longer time have said, you know, be careful. Even though you're not under attack right now, you will be. You can be. So, you know, your research on tuberculosis could be subject to the same sets of political concerns that are targeting us now. So I think, you know, I think those connections can be made and need to be made. And I think our best hope lies in demonstrating that we're all in this together, really.
Yeah, excellent point, because eventually everyone may be impacted.
That's right.
Even though you may not be in the
Yeah.
eye of the storm at the moment, you
Yeah.
certainly may be in the future. So let's talk a little bit about higher education and the role that institutions play in empowering the next generation of activists, and also in creating pathways for women's advancement. What does that look like for you, Agatha?
Well, I hope we continue to have a sort of vital and robust role in creating radical thinkers, giving people the space to start understanding how power functions. And I think for me, this is one of the reasons that I think women's and gender studies as a field has been so important. And this questioning power and making power visible and how it works is, of course, not only the purview of women's and gender studies. Lots of thinkers and activists are doing this. But I do think that in women's and gender studies, our attention to personal lived experience in relation to these larger structural forces, which I mentioned earlier, is part of the way that universities can continue to educate people to feel empowered, to notice when injustice exists, and develop a skill set to be able to try to address it in some way. So for me, when I think about how power functions and how I hope that universities can become places to kind of catalyze thinkers and actors, is recognizing that the way the power functions on different scales, and for me, this is helpful in my own work. You know, I know that people, you know, sociologists think about scale, geographers think about scale. And for me, the way women's and gender studies has helped me think about scale is from like the thinking about, right, the psychic or the internal as a kind of scale as well, one in which I have internalized these messages from society about the way things work or the way things should work. And so for me, I hope our classes and our research and our conversations can be spaces where we can encourage people to notice these internalizations, and not that they're all bad or negative or need to be changed, but recognize how power might be impacting, how at the interpersonal scale, you know, power functions, how at the sort of social or cultural scale, we exist within many different kinds of communities, all of which have their own sort of status quo and their unspoken and explicit rules, which are of course related to, you know, to power, how power functions. We have national scales and transnational scales, and I think even in the current moment, we want to think about a planetary scale when we're like wreaking havoc on the climate. And so, I don't know. I mean, this may seem a little bit abstracted from the specific moment in which certain kinds of federal and state policies are having an effect on what we do in our daily lives. But I think for me, this encourages a way of thinking in which we start noticing these impacts. And it gives us multiple ways to intervene in them. So it's not just that we have to, you know, upend capitalism, but that we can work on these other scales to try to push back against the negative impacts and the harms. So I'll stop there and let Elizabeth elaborate and give us more to think.
Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Yeah, so the question on the table, right? Because I got lost in the brilliance of Agatha's remarks, and the original question was how to encourage young women to go forward in this climate, something like that, right? Did I lose it?
Good enough. Empowering the next generation of activists and
yeah, and what universities can do to do that, right? I mean, so first of all, I think we need to fight to hold space as best we can, right? For that, you know, that's going to be a prerequisite for that. Second, and I'm, you know, however this unfolds in the coming years, I mean, I know I'm using every minute of my classes to try and to get everything that we've been talking about today across to my students, because it is so important and so critical to the future of what we do. So I'm trying to get them to see these structural connections. It's very interesting. We just had our senior thesis presentations in the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies department at Barnard, and every year I get a sense of what they're interested in and what the issues of the day are based on what the thesis topics are. And for the first time this year, since I've been doing these presentations for the last 15 years as the chair of that seminar, we had an abundance of feminist projects on critical university studies. So this had not been a big topic before, but it is now. So they're realizing just how important this is. I mean, they choose their topics themselves, but they're attentive, they're paying attention, they're good feminist scholars, they know, and they're seeing just how critical you know, what this, all of this is to the work that they've been doing, to their politics, to their ideas, to their work as intellectuals and activists. So they're getting a sense of the structural preconditions of their own thinking and action in the world, and they are intervening and they are getting politically engaged. And so as long as I can, I think we were chatting before the webinar began, like, you know, do we, you know, what do we do? Do we stay and fight even though it's exhausting? I'm staying and fighting for now, so are my students. So we're all fighting to gain space, right? And so and I'll say, you know, I think this is not coincidental also, like you know, we're a small college and we've had a small major. Our major doubled in size in the last 5 years. And so I think, you know, it's not an accident that gender studies, women's and gender studies is now under attack, right? It's precisely because we have gathered strength and prominence that that the backlash has come about. So I tell this to my students as a way of helping them also to recognize their own power and what we've gained and why it's happening, and to not give up and recede, but to keep fighting. And I guess, you know, to university administrators who I'm also in touch with increasingly, I think it is really important to preserve a space for activism on campus. And I know this is a fraught issue for a lot of different reasons, and we can talk about those, but we have to fight to keep that, especially at Columbia. I mean, this was really hard won in 1968, and there are so many efforts now to roll this back. It is so important to keep that space. Activism is another one of those bad words that that is being flagged in federal grant applications, right? And so and in right-wing discourse more generally, and I think we need to resist that. You know, I think women and gender studies came about because of activism. My colleagues in Africana studies at Barnard talk about the same thing. I mean, you know, a lot of the crucial and critical work that we do emerged out of activist projects, and that is not something to shy away from. That's something to acknowledge and celebrate.
Mm-hmm. Great. So when you think about the current attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion, on dismantling higher education, pushing back on women's studies, how do you envision young women and students leveraging sort of grassroots advocacy and the social movements to not only sort of resist, but also dismantle the systemic discrimination and inequity? And how are you advising them? Agatha, we'll start.
Well, I think this actually helps me maybe reconnect a little bit more with the previous question about, you know, what purpose educational institutions can serve a little more concretely, building on what you were mentioning, Elizabeth, about, and then this question, Gloria, about right diversity. And I'm still kind of baffled that that has become such a negative, had such negative connotations for so many people. Don't quite understand it. But I think part of what we need to hold on, make space for, as you were mentioning, Elizabeth, in our institutions is space to cultivate diverse perspectives and exposing students to diverse perspectives. And so I actually think that this is something that we really need to not cede ground on as much as we can. You know, I want us to weather the next, hopefully, only couple years, but I don't want to sort of prematurely or unnecessarily give up ground. And so, how, you know, I think the question is, you know, and it's an important question, how do we do this? And this goes back to what you were mentioning earlier, Elizabeth, about different kinds of institutions, which might have sort of different pathways where diversity can live in this moment. And so I am grateful that where I teach, you know, TWU has not prematurely ceded ground. I can't remember the phrase. Well, first of all, we're not over complying. So they're not kind of aggressively censoring things or making changes before a law mandates it. So I am grateful for that, because there are some institutions that have already kind of aggressively gone into curricula or sort of this student body activities or organizations to dismantle some of those. So they're not over complying and they're not prematurely complying. And I think that we really need, that's an important part of keeping our space. So I think I lost part of the question. So I'll see to, you know, Elizabeth to elaborate, but yeah, I think this is worth talking about more.
Elizabeth, do you want to address it as well? It's really about leveraging grassroots advocacy, social movements. How can young women and students really use that, not only to resist, but also give them ways in which they can dismantle systemic discrimination and inequity?
Yeah, I mean, a great, very difficult question, one that I've been pondering a lot since, again, I teach senior undergraduates. They're, you know, the crop of seniors that was graduating this year, I'll tell you, in February, when the assault on higher ed and gender studies became clear, some of them came to me and said, oh my gosh, I'm graduating with a degree in gender studies. What's going to happen to me? And now they're in a different place. I'll say that was February and May, and we had a good semester together. And I think they feel really glad and really proud. They graduated with a degree in gender studies, in part because what we have been doing all semester is working on building solidarities, in addressing these questions. And I think they feel better prepared than some of their peers to go out and fight and to realize that that is what's going to be necessary. Now, whether it happens on a university campus or elsewhere, that's a different question. And so I think they're figuring out exactly where they're going to do that. But I think the first step for any kind of viable activist campaign is forging coalitions, is building solidarities, and having a clear sense of your principles. And they have all of that. And so I think they felt tremendously bolstered by one another, by meeting in seminar every week, by talking about these issues. Some of them have found nonprofit spaces to work in. Some of them are thinking of building other things. I mean, some of them are even envisioning, in a worst case scenario, other models of the university. I mean, there's something here in New York where I am called the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research, where some of our graduate students have gone on to teach. I mean, hopefully we won't need, spaces outside of the university in the long term, but it may be something supplementary now that people can build. I mean, they want to take what they've learned and they want to disseminate it to others. They want to share these lessons, and without that, we have nothing. So they have inspired me as well in terms of that. Other than that, I think we're all figuring it out together right now. I mean, I will say, in terms of what this is going to look like, will there be a moment where they have to articulate things in slightly different ways than they did before in other institutional settings that they weren't anticipating? It's possible, but hopefully, as we talked about earlier in this conversation, in the service ultimately of building something better and more robust when the opportunity emerges. So in terms of my students, actually, and you can probably tell this from my affect, I mean, that's the part that inspires me the most. Like, young people, actually, I think, great for them. I don't know what I would do if I were their age, but they inspire me so much. I have quite a lot of confidence in them.
That's really great. That's really,
Yeah.
and to know that the transition from February,
Yeah.
to May, was quite impactful to
Yeah.
them, because everyone can understand how the month of February was certainly a time when people were wondering about the future in ways that, had a lot of negativity, but they were able to get to a point where
Yeah.
they could see a future, and also where they felt empowered, I think is really incredible. So kudos for you for the way in which you are inspiring students. I wanted to jump to one of the questions that was in the chat, in the question box, and it's about AAUW, as a matter of fact, wanting to know how we are collaborating to raise awareness of how the current political climate is adversely affecting women and their families. And I just wanted to lift up that AAUW is connected to a variety of coalitions. And so the ways in which we have been using our own voice has really been about our participation in the coalitions, making sure that we are signing on to, so many letters that are going to this administration to push back on so many of the ways in which it's not only about dismantling higher education, it's about the other facets that they have been attacking. And so, we are not the organization that is sitting on the sidelines. We are an organization that's actually speaking up. And I think that's really, really important to bring up. There's another way in which there's another question about what are some ways that students from underrepresented backgrounds can gain access to resources and build coalitions when they have little or no financial support? If either of you wanted to give some feedback on that question.
I can start maybe while Agatha's gathering her thoughts.
Okay.
So this, I think this falls, it's such an important question. And it falls, for me, under the category of like, if we have to rebuild the university and higher ed going forward after this, how can we do it better? So, I think one of the reasons, and my colleagues who are actually, have been working in critical university studies for a long time have been talking to me about this. How did higher education become such a target of the of the current administration and the right wing more generally? And I have one colleague who's been going to conferences saying, this has been building for a long time, and higher ed has been the main thing they've focused on. Even conferences that aren't about higher ed become about higher ed. Like, how did this happen? And one of the things, and this is maybe, a fair critique, is that it's not sufficiently inclusive, right? As a set of social institutions, we have to make it more inclusive. And so when it's not sufficiently inclusive, especially when we think in socioeconomic terms, then people resent it and they don't know what it's about, and it becomes an easy political target. So this question of how to make higher education more inclusive, and this is a feminist issue, as I was saying, it's a lot of things become feminist issues that didn't look like they were, when you think about them more carefully. It's feminist in its repercussions, and it's feminist, even in terms of the structures of access. If we think about who gains entry to the university, like how so we have to ask ourselves, how can we do this better? One way that I've been thinking about, and junior scholars in my department, graduate students are talking about where and how to publish. Open access is something to think about, right? I mean, so, how can we do more public facing work? I myself have been trying to do this in the last year and a half, rather than just writing scholarly monographs. This forum is really important, right? I mean, how can we reach more people? How can we be better public intellectuals? How can we make higher education more of a public good? I think that's the real question. And if we can address that more effectively, I think we'll be in a better place when we come out of this. And I'll be hopeful and say when, right? Not if, but.
Absolutely. Very, very, very important points. And when you think about the ways in which in higher education, sort of reaffirming its public purpose is one that we have to continuously go back to, because it really does have a purpose across our country and obviously across the globe. But if it's not filled with accessibility and opportunity, then we're always going to be facing the same issues about those who are underrepresented. And so the attacks on funding for historically Black colleges and universities and minority serving institutions, those are pieces that do need to be lifted up more. And when we talk about those potential donors, the ways in which they can offer more support to underrepresented populations, so that it's not a consistent struggle, not just to get into higher education, but once you get there, how can you afford to actually be supported and pay for your studies is really key. And so AAUW is certainly an organization that has been doing that for over 140 years, and the support that we provide to women in higher education. We have supported, thousands of women of color deliberately and intentionally, because we do believe in equity and access in higher education. So thank you for your insight. So we're getting close to wrapping up, and I wanted to ask a final question. So if you could offer one piece of advice drawn from either history or your own experience to students or scholars mobilizing for gender equity today, sort of what would that advice be? How about you, Agatha?
Okay, I appreciate the chance to really hone in on and something that is I valued deeply and hope to manifest in my practices and convey to students. And it goes back to solidarity, which is something we've been talking about, and to make more explicit, the importance of building solidarity intersectionally across, within, through, because of our differences. And we need to do this because our differences are tied to systems of privilege and oppression. And so it's not just that we're different and we want a multicultural rainbow, but that we need to do so to survive, because the ways in which we are different enriches our struggles. It helps us better understand inequities and develop richer pathways towards social justice for everybody.
Thank you. Very inspiring. Elizabeth?
Yeah, it's a great question and a great way to conclude. And I've been thinking about it in recent days since I've been getting ready for this conversation. I guess here's what I would say. Even though it seems like this, we ran headlong into this problem in February and it came out of nowhere and we weren't prepared for it. It's actually been longer than that in the making. And so we didn't get into this situation overnight, and we're probably not going to get out of it overnight either. So I guess what I would suggest, and this is both a lesson from history and from my own life, is to have longer temporal scales to think about, the sort of the slow and small baby steps that that got us into this situation, and turn to think about our way out in similar ways. And this is both, I said this is both historical, and this insight has arisen for me for both historical and personal reasons. I mean, historically, I've been now reading about the neoliberalization of the university and funding models and so on and so forth, some of which I've mentioned earlier, and also about gathering critiques in some quarters of the university, which have been building for years, but many of us were not paying enough attention. And I plead guilty to that. I wasn't paying enough attention. I knew about it abstractly, but was I all in the fight to resist this? I wasn't sufficiently, and I didn't realize where it could lead us. And so yeah, I think, as you said earlier, Gloria, in different words, like, AAUW realizes now, and has always realized, you can't be a bystander. And I think some academics have been coming to this insight as well. Maybe too late, but hopefully not, right? And so, my advice to young people would be pay attention to those small steps that can lead somewhere eventually. That is not beneficial to you, and don't wait to pay attention. Pay attention early, and once you are paying attention, have a longer temporal horizon. Even if things seem difficult right now, the steps can build on one another, and we can wind up someplace much better if we keep at it. Right.
Thank you. Very well said. I want to thank you both for sharing your valuable insight. Thank you for your knowledge. And of course, thank you for taking the time to be with all of our participants today. And as we said early on, we know that this is a conversation that could last on and on for hours. There's so much that we could be talking about, because we really are at a pivotal moment, and we really do need to continue to come together for these important conversations. But as we've seen throughout this conversation, advancing equity in higher education and in our society, it really does require more than conversation. It really does require sort of the bold collective action. And at AAUW, we have a newly launched 2025 strategic plan, and it really does outline a clear path forward as we intensify our commitment to supporting higher education as a key pathway to increase women's economic empowerment and mobility. And we are going to continue our advocacy to remove the systemic barriers and ensure that higher education remains accessible. So today, I invite each of you who are here on our call to be part of that journey through 4 powerful steps. Join and become a member of AAUW so that we can amplify our voices and our impact. Give by supporting our mission, investing in our programs that drive systemic change, and learn about AAUW's mission and position through statements on our website and social media. Act by visiting AAUW Action Network at aauw.org/act. Make your voice heard on campus. Make it heard in your community, and of course, make it heard in Congress. So just a reminder that the recording will be available on the AAUW website. and visit AUW.org to learn more about our upcoming professional development and educational programs. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. And thank you so much again, Elizabeth and Agatha, for joining us. We appreciate everything that you provided. Take care.